All right, welcome to Lesson 2, Video 2. We're going to continue on with body planes and body cavities. So in the last video, just to kind of review really quickly, we did anatomical terminology with our regional landmarks, and we also talked about directional terminology. So body planes are basically imaginary lines that we use to kind of look at different structures of the body. A lot of times when you're going to be doing surgery, you'll say do a sagittal cut or a frontal cut, and this is just explaining where we're going to make that cut or have that imaginary line go through that organ or structure. So the first one is the sagittal plane. The sagittal plane divides the body into equal right and left sides. So if you reference those two pictures, you can see that this is just going to be an imaginary line that divides it into left and right halves. We say movements that go through the sagittal plane are movements that are going front and backwards. So running or doing squats would all be in the sagittal plane. Next is the frontal plane, or it's often called the coronal plane as well. Both terms can be used interchangeably. This is going to cut the body into anterior and posterior sections. So once again, if you reference those pictures, it's an imaginary line dividing the body into front and back parts. Movements that go through the frontal plane are going to be side-to-side movements, so jumping jacks would be an example. Then we have the transverse plane. The transverse plane is going to cut the body into half, into superior and inferior parts, so above and below. Movements through this plane are going to be movements where you're going to be twisting, so maybe doing like a medicine ball twist when you're working out your abs. And then the last plane is the oblique plane, and the oblique plane is going to cut the body at an angle. So a lot of different movements we do are in the oblique plane or combine a bunch of those planes that we talked about. So just going over the three major ones, the sagittal plane is going to divide the body into right and left halves. The transverse plane is going to cut the body into superior and inferior portions. And then the frontal plane or coronal plane will divide the body into anterior and posterior sections. Our last topic is going to be body cavities. So body cavities are spaces in where your organs are held, and they provide different degrees of protection for these organs. These are also one of the first things that really start to develop when you're developing in the womb. And the two major body cavities are going to be the dorsal and ventral body cavity, but these are going to break down even further into subdivisions. So the dorsal body cavity is the first one that we're going to talk about. It's the smaller of the two body cavities, the ventral being much larger. So the dorsal body cavity is going to break down further into the cranial and spinal cavity. So if we look here, we're looking at our dorsal body cavity. That's going to divide into the cranial, which is where our brain is going to be housed. And then the vertebral cavity is going to extend basically all the way from the base of the skull down to the bottom. That is where our spinal cord is going to be held, and it's protected by those vertebrae. So the ventral body cavity is much larger than the dorsal body cavity. It contains all of the organs that are in your chest and your abdomen. The two big body cavities it divides into is going to be your thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity. So first, let's talk about the thoracic cavity. So we're looking at the thoracic cavity here, which is, there you go, part of the ventral body cavity. So all of this is what we're looking at right here. Organs of the thoracic cavity include the lungs and the heart, and it's somewhat protected by the rib cage. The mediastinum is a separate space in the thoracic cavity that's going to be housing the heart. And then we have the abdominopelvic cavity. This is going to divide down even further into two separate cavities, the abdominal and the pelvic. So the abdominal cavity is going to be right here. right below the thoracic, and it's going to contain the organs such as the stomach, the liver, the intestines, and then the pelvic cavity below here is going to contain your urinary bladder and all of your reproductive organs. So let's go over that really quickly again. So here is your two major body cavities, your dorsal and your ventral. The dorsal is going to divide into the cranial cavity, which houses your brain, and the vertebral cavity, which houses your spinal cord. The ventral body cavity is much larger and contains the thoracic cavity. The thoracic cavity is going to contain your heart and your lungs, the heart being enclosed by that mediastinum. The abdominopelvic cavity is the other major subdivision. This breaks down into the abdominal cavity, which is going to be all of your all of your digestive organs, and then your pelvic cavity here, which is going to be your reproductive organs and your urinary bladder. Then we have open body cavities. These are body cavities that lead to the outside environment. So first is going to be the oral and digestive cavity, which starts at your mouth and goes through your entire body up until the anus. Then you have your nasal cavity, which is where your nose is and goes into the respiratory system. The orbital cavities are going to house your eyes. And then your middle ear cavities are your ears, and it's going to contain tiny little bones that help transmit sound into your hearing receptors. So the last thing we're going to talk about is how surgeons and medical personnel know where to cut open the abdominal pelvic cavity. And there's two systems that we use. The first is the quadrant system. And as you can see, here's our abdominal pelvic cavity, and it's just cut into 4 quadrants. The right upper quadrant, the left upper quadrant, the right lower quadrant, and the left lower quadrant. Now, that's the easy naming system. The other system we use divides the abdominal pelvic cavity into 9 separate regions, and we're going to go over these 9 regions. So the centermost region is going to be the umbilical region, and if you remember, umbilical means navel or belly button. So this is going to be right at the belly button. The epigastric region is going to be just superior to that umbilical region. Superior means above. The hypogastric or pubic region is going to be located below the umbilical region or inferior. Then we have the inguinal or iliac regions. Those can be used interchangeably. And if you remember, inguinal means groin. So this is going to be the groin area. You have a right and a left iliac region. Then you have the right and the left lumbar regions, which are going to flank the umbilical regions. And then you have the right and the left hypochondriac region. These are going to flank or be lateral to the epigastric region. All right, so that is it for lesson 2. Please make sure you have filled in your note guide and you've watched both videos. Now you may start to complete your tasks. Thank you guys for watching.